Impossible to believe. 6 days. 6 days ago, the entire country of Peru ran a national earthquake and tsunami drill built around their absolute worst nightmare scenario, a magnitude 8. 8 earthquake off the coast near Lima and Callao, followed by a tsunami. Sirens went off. Phones buzzed with emergency alerts. Millions of people physically walked out of their homes, their offices, their schools, and practiced getting to high ground. And 6 days later, an earthquake actually hit Peru. Not the one they were drilling for, but a real powerful magnitude 7+ earthquake that shook a huge portion of the country. So let's talk about what actually happened, what the numbers really are, why there's already some disagreement between agencies about how big this thing was, and why the location and depth of this earthquake matter so much more than people realize. Here's the timeline. On Thursday, August 20th, 2026, at around 1 o'clock in the afternoon local time, a strong earthquake struck southern Peru. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because the United States Geological Survey and the European Mediterranean Seismological Center came in with a different number. They measured this same earthquake at magnitude 6. 7, with the epicenter placed slightly differently, about 38 kilometers northwest of a smaller town called 8.8, and a shallower depth of around 67 kilometers. Now, before anyone starts saying one of these agencies is lying or covering something up, I want to be really clear. This kind of disagreement is completely normal in the first few hours after a big earthquake. Different seismic networks use different sensor arrays, different models, and different processing methods, and depending on which stations picked up the waves first and how they were calibrated, you can get magnitude estimates that differ by half a point or more, especially for a deep earthquake like this one. Why does depth matter so much here? This is the part I really want you to understand, because it explains almost everything else about how this earthquake behaved. When an earthquake happens close to the surface, even a moderate one, the shaking directly above it can be absolutely violent, because there's very little rock between the rupture and the buildings sitting on top of it. But when an earthquake originates 70, 80, 100 kilometers down, that energy has to travel through a massive amount of rock before it ever reaches the surface. That rock absorbs and disperses a huge amount of the energy along the way. So directly above a deep earthquake like this, the shaking is often surprisingly moderate. In this case, the IGP recorded an intensity of only 3 to 4 on the Mercalli scale in Corocara, which is the town closest to the epicenter. 3 to 4 is noticeable, it rattles windows, it wakes people up, but it is nowhere near catastrophic. But here's the trade-off. While a deep earthquake produces less violent shaking directly above it, that same depth means the seismic waves spread outward and stay detectable across an enormous radius. And that is exactly what happened here. This earthquake was felt not just in Ayacucho, but in Ica, in Huancavelica, in Arequipa, in Cusco, in Apurimac, and even as far away as Lima, the capital, where people reported feeling a slow, rolling motion, especially in taller buildings. The head of the IGP, Hernando Tavera, went on national television afterward and explained exactly this, that because of the depth, the sensation of the earthquake was very strong across a wide area, even though the epicenter itself didn't experience anything close to that intensity. Now, let's talk about what this earthquake actually was, geologically speaking, because this is not the type of earthquake most people picture when they think about a big quake hitting Peru. Peru sits on top of one of the most seismically active boundaries on the entire planet, the meeting point between two enormous tectonic plates. The Nazca Plate, which is oceanic, sits out in the Pacific, and it is slowly, continuously diving underneath the South American plate, the continental plate that Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia, and Chile all sit on. This process is called subduction, and it happens at a rate of roughly 7 to 8 centimeters a year, which sounds small, but over geological time it is what has built the entire Andes mountain range and what makes this whole stretch of coastline one of the most dangerous seismic zones on Earth. Now, there are basically 3 different ways this collision between plates can produce an earthquake. The first, and the one everyone is most afraid of, is called a megathrust earthquake. This happens right at the boundary where the 2 plates are locked together, grinding against each other, building up enormous stress over decades or centuries until they suddenly slip. Megathrust earthquakes are the ones capable of producing magnitude 8, magnitude 9 events, and because they often involve a sudden vertical displacement of the seafloor, they are the ones that generate massive tsunamis. The second type happens on faults within the continental crust itself, closer to the surface, inland. And the third type, which is what happened here on August 20th, is called an intraslab earthquake, or intraplate earthquake. This happens not at the boundary between the 2 plates, but inside the Nazca Plate itself, after it has already descended deep underneath South America. As that plate bends and stretches and gets pulled downward by gravity, it develops internal stress, and eventually it fractures internally, kind of like bending a stiff piece of metal until it cracks, even though nothing outside is directly hitting it. This is a crucial distinction because it means this earthquake did not occur on any of the named surface faults you typically see marked on a hazard map. There's no famous fault line responsible for this one. It happened deep inside a slab of oceanic crust that has already been swallowed by the continent, roughly 70 to 108 kilometers beneath the Andes. And because this type of earthquake doesn't involve the seafloor moving vertically the way a megathrust earthquake does, there was no tsunami risk from this event at all. Chile's Navy Hydrographic and Oceanographic Service actually issued a public statement confirming exactly that, ruling out any tsunami threat to the Pacific coast, because of how deep and how far inland this rupture occurred. And here's something almost eerie. This is not the first time this exact spot has produced an earthquake like this. On August 24th, 2014, the IGP recorded an earthquake with an epicenter also 35 kilometers north of Corcora at a depth of 108 kilometers, essentially the identical location and identical depth as what just happened. That 2014 earthquake was measured at magnitude 6. And Peruvian seismologists who studied it afterward concluded it was caused by exactly the same mechanism, internal deformation, and stretching within the subducting Nazca Plate. That earthquake was felt across a radius of roughly 300 kilometers, caused some structural damage to older buildings, and triggered landslides on steep slopes around Corcora and the surrounding province. So this region has a documented history of producing this exact style of deep, wide-reaching earthquake. And what happened this week fits that pattern almost perfectly, just at what appears to be a somewhat higher magnitude, at least according to Peru's own measurement. In the immediate aftermath of this week's earthquake, initial reports from Peru's National Emergency Operations Center indicated no confirmed deaths. There were reports of landslides near Corcora and in other parts of rural Ayacucho, some cracked or damaged older homes, and roughly 6,000 households losing electricity. As a precaution, schools in the Ica region were closed the following day so authorities could inspect buildings for structural damage before letting children back inside. Local officials, including the mayor of Corcora, described the shaking as clearly felt throughout the town, though a first municipal survey had not turned up anything catastrophic. Authorities said they were continuing to monitor for aftershocks and assess more remote rural communities that take longer to reach. Now let's get back to that drill, because this is really the heart of why this story feels so unsettling. On Friday, August 14th, 2026, just 6 days before this earthquake struck, Peru carried out its second national multi-hazard drill of the year, organized by the country's Civil Defense Institute, INDECI, in coordination with the Geophysical Institute. This wasn't a small, symbolic exercise. It was a coordinated nationwide event that began at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with different simulated disaster scenarios depending on the region. In the highlands, they simulated landslides and mud flows. In the jungle regions, they simulated heavy rainfall and river flooding. But in Lima and Callao, the most densely populated part of the country, they simulated the scenario that keeps Peruvian seismologists up at night, a magnitude 8. 8 earthquake with an epicenter 60 kilometers west of Callao at a simulated depth of 42 kilometers, followed by a tsunami. At exactly 3:06 in the afternoon during that drill, cell phones across the entire country received an emergency alert warning of an incoming wave, telling people to immediately move away from beaches, ports, and coastal boardwalks and head toward a higher, safer ground. In La Punta, a low-lying district of Callao that is considered one of the most exposed areas to a real tsunami, residents specifically practiced evacuating to vertical safe zones. President Keiko Fujimori took part in the drill personally, leading activities from Lima's main square, and afterward, officials presented a chilling hypothetical damage report based on the simulated scenario. Depending on which official's figures you look at, the projected toll from an earthquake of that scale hitting the capital ranged from around 8,181 to nearly 10,126 people dead, somewhere between 139,000 and 165,000 injured, more than 1 million families displaced, and nearly 4 million people affected in some way. They even projected that 88 health centers would be destroyed in that scenario. These aren't predictions of what will happen. They're modeled estimates used purely to stress test the emergency response system and to force planners to confront what a worst-case scenario would actually look like on the ground. The date of this drill wasn't random either. It was chosen deliberately to mark the anniversary of a real historic disaster, the magnitude 7.9 earthquake that struck Peru's central coast on August 15th, 2007. That earthquake hit near Pisco in the Ica region, and it remains one of the most destructive seismic events in the country's modern history. Official figures from that disaster list around 596 people dead, well over 1,000 injured, and tens of thousands of homes destroyed or made uninhabitable across Ica, Pisco, and Chincha. It also generated a tsunami that flooded parts of Lima's coastal highway and swept through Pisco's waterfront. Every year around this anniversary, Peru uses the memory of that event to reinforce why these drills matter. And this year's drill also came in the shadow of very recent regional tragedy, just 10 days after a magnitude 7. 4 earthquakes struck Colombia on August 10th, which killed more than 200 people and caused serious damage, and roughly 7 weeks after a significant earthquake had also struck Venezuela. Peruvian officials openly acknowledged that the geographic closeness of those disasters had sharpened public attention on the country's own seismic risk heading into the drill. And that risk is not some vague, generic warning. Peru's central coast, the stretch running roughly parallel to Lima and Callao, is considered one of the most closely monitored seismic gaps in South America. A seismic gap is a section of a plate boundary that hasn't ruptured in a major earthquake for a long time, even while the surrounding sections have, which tells scientists that stress has likely been quietly building up there instead of being released. According to the head of the IGP, there is a roughly 400-kilometer stretch of Peru's central coastline where this kind of stress has been steadily accumulating, and it's precisely why the 8.8 magnitude scenario was chosen as the basis for this year's drill. It's grounded in real geophysical monitoring, not just a dramatic worst-case number pulled out of thin air. This region has a long, brutal history of major earthquakes, going all the way back to events like the 1586 Lima Callao earthquake, an estimated magnitude 8, one event that produced a 5-meter tsunami and caused major destruction across the young colonial city in what was the first major earthquake to hit Lima after its founding. So here's the important distinction I really want to hammer home, because it's the difference between panic and understanding. The earthquake that actually happened this week, the 7, 2 or 6, 7, depending on your source, is not the earthquake that scientists and emergency planners are worried about along that seismic gap. This week's event happened deep inside the Nazca Plate itself, well inland beneath the Andes, as an intraslab rupture with no tsunami potential. The scenario that terrifies seismologists, the one the drill was built around, is a shallow megathrust rupture at the actual boundary between the two plates, offshore, capable of displacing the seafloor and sending a wall of water toward one of the most densely populated coastlines in South America. These are two fundamentally different kinds of earthquakes, in two different locations, caused by two different mechanisms. One just happened. The other one hasn't, and nobody, not the IGP, not the USGS, not any seismologist anywhere in the world, can tell you exactly when or if it will. That last point matters enormously. And I don't want anyone walking away from this thinking that this week's earthquake was some kind of warning sign that the big one is imminent. It isn't, at least not in any way science can currently measure. Earthquake prediction, in the sense of knowing the exact time, date, and magnitude of a future quake, simply doesn't exist yet, anywhere in the world. What scientists can do is calculate long-term probabilities based on how much stress has built up along a fault or a plate boundary since the last major rupture. And by that measure, Peru's central seismic gap is considered overdue for something significant, which is exactly why it forms the basis of these national drills. But overdue in geological terms can mean any time between tomorrow and several decades from now. That uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it's also honest, and it's a very different statement than saying an earthquake is coming soon. What actually connects this week's earthquake to the drill isn't cause and effect, it's coincidence layered on top of genuine, well-founded national anxiety. Peru didn't run that drill because officials somehow knew a real earthquake was 6 days away. They ran it because it was scheduled as part of the country's 2025 to 2027 national preparedness calendar, timed to the anniversary of the 2007 disaster, and reinforced by the very real, very recent earthquakes that had just struck Colombia and Venezuela. The fact that a genuine, unrelated earthquake then struck less than a week later is what makes this story feel so eerie, but it's important to separate the emotional weight of that timing from any claim of prediction or causation. These two events are not mechanically linked. They just happen to land close together on the calendar, in a country that, unfortunately, has more than enough seismic activity for that kind of coincidence to occur. What I do think is worth taking away from all of this is something less dramatic, but honestly more useful. And that's how well-prepared Peru actually is compared to a lot of other places in the world that sit on similarly dangerous fault systems. Running a coordinated nationwide drill with real sirens, real phone alerts, real evacuation routes, and real participation from schools, hospitals, and government buildings is not a small undertaking. It requires planning, coordination between multiple agencies, and buy-in from millions of ordinary people who have to actually leave their desks and their classrooms and walk outside. A lot of regions around the world that sit on comparably dangerous subduction zones simply don't do this kind of large-scale public rehearsal, and when a real earthquake eventually does strike those places, the lack of practiced muscle memory shows. Whatever else you take from this story, that's probably the most important practical lesson. That rehearsal and public education genuinely save lives when the geology eventually does what geology on a subduction zone is always going to do eventually. As for this week's earthquake itself, The situation on the ground remains one to watch, rather than one to panic over. Authorities are continuing to monitor for aftershocks, which is standard procedure after any earthquake of this size, and continuing to assess more remote communities in the mountainous areas around Coracora and Parinacochas province that are harder to reach and slower to report damage. Older adobe-style structures, which are still common in parts of rural Ayacucho, are historically the most vulnerable to this kind of shaking, along with mountain roads that are prone to rockfalls and landslides during and after seismic events, which is exactly the kind of damage that was reported in the areas closest to the epicenter this time. As of the most recent reporting, no fatalities had been confirmed, and officials described the overall situation as serious but not critical, with ongoing inspections rather than emergency rescue operations underway. So, to bring this all together, what happened this week was a real, significant magnitude 7 class earthquake, deep beneath the southern Peruvian Andes, caused by internal stress fracturing inside the already subducted Nazca Plate, a mechanism that has produced a strikingly similar earthquake in the exact same location before, back in 2014. It was felt across a huge swath of southern and central Peru because of its depth, but it produced only moderate shaking directly above the epicenter for that same reason, and it carried no tsunami risk whatsoever because it did not occur along the offshore plate boundary. What makes the story feel so dramatic is not the earthquake's mechanics, which are honestly a fairly well understood and relatively survivable category of seismic event, but its timing, landing just 6 days after the entire nation had rehearsed its response to a completely different, far more catastrophic scenario, a magnitude 8. 8 megathrust earthquake and tsunami that remains a genuine long-term risk for Lima and Callao, but one that is not something anyone can honestly say is imminent based on what happened this week. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about Peru's broader place on what's often called the Pacific Ring of Fire, because I think it helps put this week's earthquake in perspective. The Ring of Fire is this horseshoe-shaped band that traces almost the entire rim of the Pacific Ocean, running up through Chile, Peru, Central America, Mexico, the west coast of North America, across through Japan, Indonesia, and down through the South Pacific. It's not a single fault, it's a chain of subduction zones and volcanic arcs where oceanic plates are being forced underneath continental or other oceanic plates all around that ocean basin. Roughly 90% of the world's earthquakes happen somewhere along that ring, and the vast majority of the planet's active volcanoes sit on it too. Peru's stretch of that ring, where the Nazca Plate dives beneath South America, is one of the most active individual segments of the whole system, which is part of why a country of roughly 34 million people has had to build such a sophisticated relationship with earthquake preparedness, compared to a lot of other nations its size. Historically, this subduction zone has produced some genuinely massive earthquakes. In 2001, a magnitude 8.4 earthquake struck off the coast near Arequipa, killing more than 100 people and generating a destructive local tsunami. In 2007, as I mentioned, the Pisco earthquake hit at magnitude 7, 9 becoming one of the deadliest natural disasters in Peru's modern history. And going back further, the historical record includes events like the 1746 earthquake that devastated Lima and Callao, an event so severe that Callao was almost completely destroyed by the accompanying tsunami, with only a small fraction of the city's population reportedly surviving. That 1746 disaster is actually one of the key historical reference points seismologists use when they talk about how much stress may have reaccumulated along the central coast since then, because in geological terms, roughly 280 years is enough time for an enormous amount of strain to build back up along a locked plate boundary. It's part of the scientific reasoning behind treating the current seismic gap near Lima and Callao as a serious long-term hazard rather than a hypothetical one. It's also worth understanding why intraslab earthquakes like the one that just hit Ayacucho tend to show up somewhat regularly in this part of Peru, and why seismologists aren't automatically alarmed every time one occurs. As the Nazca Plate continues its slow descent beneath South America, it doesn't sink as a rigid, unchanging slab. It bends. It stretches under its own weight as gravity pulls the leading edge down faster than the trailing edge can follow, and in places it can even partially detach or tear. All of that internal stress has to go somewhere, and when it's released suddenly, it produces exactly this kind of deep intraslab rupture, usually with what geologists call normal faulting, meaning the rock on one side of the break essentially drops relative to the other side, consistent with the plate being pulled downward and stretched rather than being compressed the way it would be in a shallow boundary line megathrust event. This mechanism has produced other significant earthquakes across Peru and neighboring countries over the years at similar depths, and while each one is taken seriously and studied individually, They're generally understood by scientists as part of the ordinary, ongoing physics of a plate that is actively sinking into the mantle, not as precursors to a larger, unrelated event happening somewhere else along the coast. Let's talk a bit more about what people on the ground actually experienced, because the human side of this story matters just as much as the numbers. In Korokora, the town closest to the epicenter, residents described the shaking as a long, rolling sensation lasting close to a full minute, long enough that people had time to get outside, but disorienting enough that several described the experience as unsettling even without severe damage resulting from it. Dust and sand were reportedly kicked up in the streets in some areas as older structures shifted and settled. Further away, in cities like Ica and Arequipa, residents described feeling a slower, swaying motion rather than a sharp jolt, which is a telltale signature of a deep earthquake's energy reaching the surface after traveling through so much rock. And in Lima itself, hundreds of kilometers from the epicenter, many people said the shaking was subtle enough that it was mostly noticed by residents on the upper floors of taller buildings, where even distant deep earthquakes tend to get amplified by the natural sway of the structure. A phenomenon engineers are very familiar with when it comes to how tall buildings respond to long-period seismic waves traveling from far away. For emergency responders, this earthquake became something of a real-world test of the exact systems that had just been rehearsed 6 days earlier. Civil defense teams mobilized to inspect roads for rockfall and landslide damage in the mountainous terrain around Parinacochas province. Power crews worked to restore electricity to the thousands of households that lost it. And school administrators in the Ica region made the call to keep students home for a day while engineers checked buildings for structural cracks before allowing classes to resume. None of this rose to the level of the emergency scenarios described in the August 14th drill, but officials have noted that having just walked through evacuation procedures, checked safe zones, and reviewed communication protocols days earlier, likely made this real response smoother and faster than it might otherwise have been, even for an earthquake of a completely different type and scale than the one they had rehearsed for. It's also worth remembering that this wasn't the only seismic activity Peru had seen in the days leading up to this event. The day before, on August 19th, a moderate earthquake in the magnitude 4 range rattled parts of the Lima region, waking some residents and being accompanied, according to several local reports, by an audible rumbling sound before the shaking began, something that can happen with certain types of shallow, nearby earthquakes as compressional waves reach the surface slightly ahead of the more disruptive shear waves. That smaller event caused no significant damage and wasn't directly connected to the larger earthquake that struck Ayacucho the following day, but it added to a general sense of heightened seismic awareness across the country during a week that was already unusually eventful. So where does this leave things going forward? Peru's authorities have made clear that monitoring continues. Aftershock sequences following a magnitude 7 class intraslab earthquake can continue for days or even weeks, though these deep events tend to produce noticeably fewer and smaller aftershocks compared to shallow boundary line earthquakes of a similar size, simply because the fractured rock is under different stress conditions at that depth. Damage assessment teams continue working through the more remote parts of Ayacucho, checking structures that may not have been visible in the first wave of reporting. And the broader, longer-term conversation about the seismic gap off the central coast, the one the August 14th drill was built to prepare for, continues in the background exactly as it did before this week's earthquake. Because, as I said earlier, this event and that looming larger risk are not the same story, even though the calendar brought them close enough together to make for an unsettling coincidence. I'll keep watching this story and update you if the numbers change, if the magnitude gets revised again, or if damage reports out of the more remote parts of Ayacucho start coming in with a different picture than what we're seeing right now. But for today, the honest summary is this. A strong, deep earthquake hit southern Peru. It was felt across an enormous area. It caused limited damage and no confirmed deaths as of the latest reports. It carried no tsunami threat, and it happened to land just days after a national drill that had nothing to do with predicting it, but everything to do with making sure that when Peru's real worst-case scenario eventually does arrive, the country will be just a little more ready for it. And honestly, that last part might be the story worth paying the most attention to. Not the eerie coincidence of the calendar, but the fact that a country sitting on one of the most dangerous stretches of plate boundary on Earth just proved, almost by accident, that its preparation systems work, that its people know where to go when the alerts go out, and that when the geology of the Ring of Fire eventually delivers the earthquake everyone there has been quietly bracing for, Peru will have practiced for it more than once.